Title lover. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be one of the moderators. I will take a leaf out of Fiamma and Winston Peters, and I'm not going to follow through the script that I have in terms of moderating this session, but on one condition. We decided we're going to apply the Chatham House rule to our panel. That means we're really going to be open up with our honest opinions about what we feel. So before I do so, I would like to introduce the panels. Please come on stage, please. So we have, the first one is Professor James Warlick. I don't need to explain. James and I used to be good colleagues working together at NIWA. We both left and moved on with our careers. We were both nominated for the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report in 2001. James decided he's not going to join us here today, which is true to his work. He walked the talk because of, guess what? Carbon footprint reasons. So he's going to join us on externally. I wish I can stay in Wellington and do the same thing, moderating from Wellington, but I was asked to come here. The other one, on the members of the panel, Coral Passisi from Niue. We go back a long way. She's been through international, regional organization, and also government and NGOs. The next speaker is Mary, Pacific Warriors champion. I don't need to introduce her. Very active here in New Zealand and internationally. And finally, Nicole from my Oxfam. And when I did a Google on Nicole, I wanted to find out about what Oxfam was all about. And I realized it's really have a connection here with us. So Oxford is the acronyms for Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, set up in Oxford in 1942 during World War II to provide relief to World War victims in Europe. Perhaps a similar relief committee or facility be considered to provide relief to climate change war victims here in the Pacific. So it's great to be here with and working with you on this panel. So now I have a few slides to introduce the topic and what we wanted to look at. Okay, that's sort of trying to summarize the whole climate change issue. What is really clear, climate change is a very complex issue. It's not simple. It's what I call systems of system. It's made up of a system, political, scientific, legal, financial. It's really, really complicated. So this is what the organizers of the meeting wanted us to focus on. Climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the Pacific people. I argue that it is not. I reckon, personally myself, is energy security is the single greatest threat to the Pacific for economic reasons. Because energy security is the flip side of climate change. And energy industry is the biggest industry in the world. Can somebody tell me exactly or estimate how much subsidy for fossil fuels per year? I will give you the answer later. Where we are today, so I'm focusing now on a global scale because it's a global issue. This just came out in September last month in New York at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit meeting of where we are right now in terms of the carbon budget. What is very clear is like fossil fuel burning and cement production release 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions from human activities, with net forestation releasing the remaining 10%. So really, if you want to address climate change, you focus on the fossil fuel industry. And even after a 3-year sort of like break with stable emissions, in global emissions in the last 3 years, it go up again. And the reason why is because of this. If you look at the key emitters in the world up to 2018, China is the largest, followed by the US and others. So for me, if China and the US are out of the pictures, almost half of the global emissions will not be dealt with. Then whatever we do is not going to make a difference. And this is the challenge for all of us. It's really difficult. And you cannot just like simplify and say, this is here in the Pacific, this is what we're focusing on. We're calling for 20% emission reduction or 50% or 60%. This is the key. And why in my research with my colleagues at at both Oxford and Harvard, we sort of foresee that it's business as usual. Since 1990, when the negotiations happened, the emissions have continued to rise. So the only way we can bring down the temperature is geoengineering the climate, which brings us into that issue of geoengineering. Quickly on geoengineering is 2 ways of doing it. One, carbon dioxide removal, like planting trees, very simple example. That's not controversial. The second one is far more controversial. It's the solar geoengineering, or what we call solar radiation modification. And it's a planetary scale technology that we're working on at Harvard to try and solve the problem. Very easy to do. You just spray some aerosols in the top of the troposphere, and then it will dim solar radiation coming into planet Earth. So it's basically shielding the Earth with particles to be able to do that. And we have that naturally through volcanic eruptions. When volcanic eruptions erupts, they give sulfur aerosols into the stratosphere and cool it down. It happens in Mount Pinatubo in 1991. So the science, we're working really quickly on the science. The problem is the governance and government rules are not catching up with us. So we've been stuck now in terms of our research to try to find a problem, answer to the problem, with governance issues that we weren't aware of. But I'm really familiar with the issues about governance of geoengineering. I wrote a chapter for a book on why small islands needs to be engaged in this conversation. For me, like the Americans say, you have to sit at the table or you're going to be on the menu. On those words, I'll now ask our colleagues. I've given you a very quick snapshot of what's going on globally and how the atmosphere see, because the atmosphere doesn't recognize political boundaries. My emission in Wellington is exactly the same impact in the atmosphere as your emission in Fiji or somewhere else. So it's a very complicated issue that needs to be addressed. So bring it down now to the region. I invite my colleagues, James Warlick, who's going to be zooming in from Wellington. James.
Kia ora. Kalafalava. I trust everyone can hear me. It's great to be in this meeting and yet not there physically. I haven't done this too often. I hope this becomes more commonplace, as it's a great way to cut your carbon footprint, to not fly to a conference. But anyway, lovely to be involved. Really interesting to hear the opening remarks. So I plan to just set the scene by going through quite quickly some of the issues that face the Pacific around climate change. and we'll move on from there to what that all implies. So just starting off with the actual climate of the South Pacific, and this is a figure that comes from CSIRO from one of their publications nearly 10 years ago now. So we see that blue region is where the main rainfall bands are, and the most important one for the South Pacific is the South Pacific Convergent zone, which lies from the region of Papua New Guinea near the equator, and it runs southeastwards across Samoa, the Cook Islands, and out into the Central Pacific where it dissipates. And the SPCZ, so-called, is dominated or controlled by the trade winds in the equatorial region and the storms and westerly winds that come through from further south from the New Zealand-Australia region. So the fluctuations in the trade winds, which are associated with the El Nino, La Nina cycle, really control whereabouts the SPCZ lies. It's really only there in the wet season from about November through to April, but its location is really important for where the rain falls, how wet the wet season is, and it actually has a big influence on tropical cyclone activity as well. Tropical cyclones in the South Pacific form only on the southern side of the SPCZ. So as that zone moves around, the locations where tropical cyclones can form and can travel can change from one year to the next. So that's the average picture. I'll move on now to what the models are saying for the future and what that might imply for some of the island nations in the Pacific. So these two rather boring looking graphics here come from the last IPCC report, the last big one, the 5th assessment report that came out in 2013. We're in the process of updating that now, but they're still pretty relevant. So what we've got here is for a middle of the road scenario, RCP 4.5, which gives us a little more than 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century. On the left, the pattern of temperature change across the central equatorial tropical Pacific on the left there, and on the right, the change in rainfall. And this is through the wet season, basically. So it's December, January, February for temperature on the left, and October through to March for precipitation on the right. So it's the sort of the median result from the model. So on the left, you can see the temperature change is pretty bland, a little warmer in the east than the west, but the changes in temperature are pretty close to the global average. So that's concern enough. I'll get onto that in a sec. And on the right, the rainfall pattern, this is the median or something like the average. We see a big increase in the equatorial region associated with changes in the El Nino cycle and the amount of rain that is associated with that. And then outside the equatorial band further south, the changes are small. We're talking less than 10%, and plus or minus. So on average, it's not very much. And that hatching means the change is nothing special compared to the typical ups and downs from one year to the next. So nothing too dramatic in terms of average changes, but the big story here is changes in the variability. So if you look in that southern box that encompasses most of the South Pacific Island nations and goes out quite far to the east, we see this graphic here that runs from 1900 through to the end of this century, and this is from models. So the numbers on the vertical axis are percentage change from the current normal, essentially. So the solid lines, the thick lines, are the average over all the models that we used, and then the hazy, the shading, or the little vertical lines, these are the individual model results for individual years. And what you can see is that the average change is close to zero, averaged over that whole box. There's really not a lot of change in average precipitation expected for the rest of the century. But you can see that the variability, the width of the individual results increases over time, and especially it increases on the downside. That is, the chances of getting a dry season, a dry wet season, go up over time. So this is associated with the South Pacific Convergent zone moving around more and moving out of the way more. So we end up with years that are quite a lot drier than normal, and also a little bit of a chance of it becoming a bit wetter some years as well. So that's concern enough. But then when you look at the equatorial region, where the average increase is quite noticeable, you see a rather more dramatic result. So the one I've just shown, the vertical scale goes up to plus 100, that is double the present average. When you look in the equatorial region, that central box, again, the averages, they do go up, but it's a little hard to see how much because the vertical scale has to be so large to capture the individual ups and downs. We're now going up to 1,000%. So that means the models are saying that some years going through the rest of the century, we might see 4, 6, 8, even 10 times the normal amount of precipitation in that equatorial region that includes Kiribati, for instance. So the ups and downs in annual precipitation in the equatorial belt are expected to become much, much larger. And that has huge implications for water availability, flooding, for lack of precipitation sometimes, especially in the southern region, but especially in that equatorial region, the potential for inundation just goes off the charts virtually before the end of this century. And that's with a not especially dramatic scenario for the future. And looking at the South Pacific Convergent Zone just quickly, here's a graphic from a global data set of an approximate average location of the zone. So this is the centre of where you tend to get most of the precipitation in the wet season. And so that's the average over 40 years. But when you look at individual years, it can be all over the place. It tends often to lie north of, say, Fiji, but it moves around quite a bit from one year to the next. So those movements, which are expected to increase over time, they really control how much precipitation individual island nations get. And the worry there is that in some years where we have very strong El Nino events, you get the red line. So the zone moves right out of the way of the Southwest Pacific, and it lies almost along a latitude line about 5 degrees south all the way into the Eastern Pacific. So everywhere south of there, rainfall is decreasing quite a lot, and that's most of the South Pacific nations. And south of that line, tropical cyclones can rove around pretty much wherever they like. So the scope for tropical cyclone activity farther east in the Pacific increases a lot in these sorts of events when there's a very strong El Nino. And the models are telling us that the chances are these kind of events will be more common in future. So the chances of getting this wide swing of the South Pacific Convergent Zone increase over time. And if that happens, this has major implications for extreme events associated with tropical cyclones, especially in the more eastern islands, but also water availability and drought in a lot of the Pacific Island nations. In those years, it would be pretty dry in most of the South Pacific. So that's precipitation. Looking at temperature, I wanted to show quickly this idea of emergence or expulsion, depending who you talk to. This is a graphic from Scott Power, a researcher in Australia, looking at the idea that how long do you have to wait before the climate changes enough to be outside of our normal experience? So the graphic here, the shaded part is the sort of normal ups and downs of temperatures for a hypothetical place in the tropical Pacific. And then as the climate warms, you see the ups and downs go outside of that range after a while. So the question is when and how much do they go outside of the normal range or the historical range. My colleague Dave Frame here at Victoria University and his colleagues wrote a nice paper on this a few years ago, looking at different scenarios for the future. So what's shown on this graph is an index basically of how far outside the normal range temperatures would get by the end of the century under different climate change scenarios. So this is for RCP 8.5, the one where emissions just keep increasing right through the century as they have done the last 30 or 40 years. And we get to 4 or 5 degrees of global warming. And what's going on this graphic is a number of 1 on the scale is where a high temperature extreme one year is unusual, but it's not unknown. It probably happened a few times in a typical person's lifetime. By the time you get to 2, they were calling this unfamiliar. It will be something that might only happen once every 40 or 50 years. And at 3, it's essentially unknown, something that would happen probably only once in 100 or 200 years or so. So the colours here, and these numbers go up to over 20. So anything beyond about 3 is off the charts, and we're getting numbers across a lot of the tropics of well above 5 and above 10 even in most places. So what this is saying is that if we don't mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, high temperature extremes in a lot of the tropics are going to go completely off the chart, and the climate we'll experience in terms of temperatures will be just unobserved, unknown by anybody. The reason things change so quickly in the tropics is because the variability of temperatures in the tropics is very low. It's the warmest part of the world, but it's also one of the least variable parts of the world. The numbers look much lower down over New Zealand and further south because the ups and downs from year to year are so big. So we have a bigger range of what we're familiar with, basically. So this is a major concern. If we let temperatures go up 4 or 5 degrees this century, the whole of the tropics would be in a climate that's just completely unknown. However, if we mitigate successfully and keep warming below 2 degrees under this scenario, RCP 2.6, the numbers look much, or the colours look much more benign. Most parts of the world are down in the sort of 1s and 2s, which are still concerning, but not as catastrophic as the previous. And a lot of the tropical Southwest Pacific is in that sort of zone of around 2. So it would have moved things quite a bit, but not right off the scale as we saw before. So that's a really good reason for mitigation. And I think the other main concern, possibly the main concern in the Pacific, is sea level rise. And this is a graphic time series of how sea levels have changed on the global average for the last, well, getting on for 30 years now, 25 years or so since the early 1990s. And the average rate of rise is around 3.5 millimetres per year at the moment. And we've had about 25 centimetres of sea level rise over the last 150 years or so. As the big ice sheets start to melt more quickly, the rate of rise is increasing. So this trend of 3.4, 3.5 millimetres per year at the moment is about 3 times as much as we had a century ago. So we're seeing that rate of rise increasing, and that's going to continue whatever we do with emissions over the next century or so. But the pattern of sea level rise is really important. It's not uniform everywhere. So if we look at the pattern over that same period from 1993, what we see is, and this is in millimetres per year, the Western Pacific is rising at faster than the global rate. So in the region sort of north of, I guess, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, up towards the equatorial Western Pacific, we're looking at maybe 4 or 5 millimetres per year, while in the Eastern Pacific, it's actually close to 0 in that period. So the Western Pacific is a bit of a hot spot for sea level rise, or it has been over that period, although that varies. If you look at the period from 1993 to 2005, it really stands out. We're talking about 10 millimetres per year or more, really extreme sea level rise compared to the global average. But then if you look at the period after that, from 2006, there are still some places where the sea level rise is greater, but for a good part of the tropical Pacific in the west, things have dropped away, and actually sea levels fell in some parts of the Western Pacific in the last 10 years or so. So this is to do with the strength of the trade winds, the prevalence of El Nino events or La Niñas. So just to make the point that we need to consider natural variations when we're thinking about sea level rise. But the long-term change, those sort of things average out, and we end up with something more like this pattern. So the Western Pacific is expected to see faster than the global average in sea level rise. So we're looking at 4 or 5 millimetres per year already, and that's going to increase from here. So the thing to do is to stop this from happening. Pene talked about solar radiation management and ways of geoengineering. Really what we need to do is stop putting carbon dioxide in the air ultimately. So this is how carbon dioxide concentrations have changed over the last few thousand years. You can see the big spike since the Industrial Revolution. We've pushed CO2 levels from 280 parts per million right up to about 410 now. And global temperatures have gone up a little bit more than 1 degree. Because carbon dioxide stays in the air so long, it's a very simple calculation to work out how long it would take at present rates to put enough in the air to get us to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 3 degrees. So this is, yeah, I've got these numbers here. It's pretty sobering stuff. So this amount of carbon dioxide, we know from measurements, gives you about 1.1 degrees of warming, a little over 1 degree of warming. So at present rates of emission, within about 10 years, we will have put enough carbon dioxide in the air to guarantee 1.5 degrees of warming. It would take a few more years than that to happen, but it would be absolutely on the cards after that. And to get to 2 degrees, we're talking about 20 years from now. So with 2030 and then 2040, we'd have enough carbon dioxide for 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming within about 50 years, so certainly well before the end of the century. So this is why it's a climate emergency. We don't have time to waste. If we're going to reduce emissions in line with the bottom end of the Paris Agreement, with the New Zealand Zero Carbon Bill, we need to see that rate of emissions come down essentially straight away, because we don't want that graph of carbon dioxide getting too much higher. So that 1.5 degrees of warming, which we get in 10 years if we do nothing, that amount of carbon dioxide emission actually translates to the same amount if we reduced emissions by half in the next 10 years and then got to zero emissions by 2050 as a global community. That would add up to the same amount of emissions as just doing nothing at all for the next 10 years. So the goals of the Zero Carbon Bill and the guidelines given in the IPCC's 1 and 1.5 degree report get us there. Exactly how we do it, how the Chinese and the Americans and the rest of us actually achieve this is another story, but it can be done. But this is the kind of goals we're looking at, really a big ask for the global economy, but I think it is actually possible even now. Anyway, look, I've gone on long enough, I think. For the Pacific, several things are going on, but certainly rainfall variability is increasing and is set to increase quite dramatically. And broadly speaking, you could say the places that are wettest get wetter, the places that are driest get drier, but the ups and downs from one year to the next increase dramatically. Temperature extremes really going off the scale. I mean, the tropical Pacific, the tropics generally are the hot spot for this kind of thing, because the natural variability is so small. We can get to unknown temperatures very quickly. And that has all sorts of implications for human health, for agriculture, and just for lifestyle and livelihoods generally. Sea level rise faster than the global average, but that from one decade to the next, there's a lot of natural variability. However, over the rest of the century, we're guaranteed to see 0.5 metre more sea level rise, and certainly could easily be more than 1 metre by the end of this century, and up to 2 metres by the middle of next century if we don't reduce emissions quite quickly. So even 0.5 metre, even what we've had already, is leading to big increases in coastal inundation, and we would see major problems, major displacement of populations, even at the bottom end of that scale. So this is a huge concern for the Pacific, and all sorts of implications for statehood, migration, refugees, and so on. So I'm sure we'll hear more about that. And my final point, if we're going to solve this problem, emissions have to reduce urgently, like right away. The IPCC report talked about 2020 being the year where global emissions have to start coming down. That's the absolute last year we've got. So we really need to get onto this urgently. But we're causing the problem. We can stop it when we choose to. So I know that the Pacific Voice has been very powerful in getting those limits, like 1.5 degrees, into the Paris Agreement. So I hope the Pacific can inspire New Zealand and the countries of the world to take the action we need to take. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Hold on to your questions. We'll go through the panel and then we'll deal with questions later. The next speaker is Coral. Please, Coral.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Do I have to start singing? Well, thank you so much for the honour to come and share my views. I'm a mum, That's my claim to fame, my biggest qualification. I think there's actually no greater role than raising the human race. I am going to talk to you today a little bit about climate fragility, the climate security issue that we've heard a lot about, and earlier speakers have touched on. And really, my views are really, I can only speak on behalf of myself. I've been very privileged to work in the region for a number of years. I was born and raised and live in the Pacific, one of the endangered species of niue that's still in niue. And I've seen with my own eyes the changes that I think equate to what is the threat to our country's future and our youth's future, and we need to do something about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about what climate security means to Pacific people, a little bit about the global context, and we've heard some of that, the regional context, and I've done some research of my own in the last sort of year around what the big climate fragility issues are for the region and how those might manifest in security challenges that we have to deal with, and some entry points in addressing that. I'm going to rush through some of these slides. I think we've taken a fair bit of time, and you can have these slides if you're interested in them and go through the detail at your leisure. But I really just wanted to focus a little bit around the discussion of what climate security is. We use this term very flippantly, but it is a much more complicated issue than that terminology itself. I think the most important thing that we've heard today is that Pacific Islanders themselves need to define this. And the discussions that have evolved as a result of our leaders' determination to raise the profile of climate security in the international arena and in our own region with our key partners has really resulted in focused discussion on what this actually means. And it means different things to different people. So there's no wrong answer in here, except in the last year, the Pacific Island countries themselves have articulated this to mean the implication of climate change on the national, human and environmental security of our people and our countries. And that's really important, because in the international arena, if you talk to the UN Security Council or members of the UN Security Council, they're constantly saying, but you have to tie this back to war. You have to tie this back to conflict for it to be an issue that the Security Council will deal with. And I don't think that's true, and I think Deputy Prime Minister of Samoa has shown and articulated very well that the Pacific has led and championed the changes at the global level that need to happen in this climate change space with the 1.5, and they can do this in climate security, and they are doing it. And I think it's important that we dig deep ourselves and understand what climate security actually means for our countries and our region so we can start addressing that. It basically is that a multitude of issues are going to affect and have a cascading impact on our security, our environmental, human, and national security. And it's going to happen at different scales and different time periods, and it's very site-specific, so we have to get down to the details to understand that. It's not all bad, though. Even though this is a complex issue, we have a range of resources that can be brought to the table and stakeholders that can work together to address that. I won't go into too much detail around this, but at the global level, basically the UN system has been talking about climate security since 2007. In 2007, 2009, the UN Security Council, the UNGA, talked about climate change and the potential implications of security that it is going to have on some countries. And this was led by Pacific Small Island Developing States. There was a period of quietness on this issue over the next sort of 10 years. And the real focus studies that brought this issue back up were around the implications that climate change was exacerbating war-torn areas in Africa, in the Sahel and Lake Chad and whatnot. And what annoys me is the Security Council and the UN system recognized that this is an existential threat for small island states, but then they didn't do any studies on our region. They only looked at Africa, and because there was those areas what had a lot of conflict and violence. And so basically, what's happened is at the international level, a number of our small island states have formed what they call the Group of Friends that's working on trying to ensure that climate change and its implications on our countries is considered a security issue that warrants the response of the Security Council and the full UN membership and UN bodies. So basically, the Secretary General has taken this quite seriously over the last sort of 2 to 3 years and focused the efforts of the UN in trying to figure out what this actually means. So they established what they call the Climate Security Mechanism, which is a very small team of people from UNDP, UNEP, and DPPA to build knowledge products on what this means and to try and figure out how we can advocate this issue to be taken up by all of the arms and arsenal of the UN system and partners to get this addressed. The group of friends in New York that is pushing this issue is chaired by Nauru and Germany at the moment. And Germany is taking up its presidency of the Security Council through 2019 to 2020. I think it's actually going to be in June specifically next year. And they pull together what they call a Climate Security Experts Network. I just happen to be asked to join that. I don't have any claims to being a climate security expert. I don't think anyone does really. But I am the only Pacific Island person on that group at the moment. So I have a responsibility I feel is way above my ability. And so, of course, as a good islander, I've called on all my friends to give me information and all the regional agencies and stakeholders, and they've been fantastic. This slide really is just to show you, reiterate some of the points earlier made. This region is not a region that lacks security agreements. 1985 was the first one in the Rarotonga Treaty on nuclear-free Pacific, and that was successful. And all of these other ones that have come after that have really had big impacts in our region. The Bikatawa Declaration, upon which the Ramsey, the support to the Solomon Islands was undertaken, was very successful. The Nasanini Declaration in 2002 was basically our response to 9/11. And it sometimes irks me that, you know, when this happened, when the 9/11 issue happened, which was awful, and we all watched this with horror, after that we all agreed to invest a lot of money and effort and capacity in beefing up our security at airports in the Pacific. And terrorism wasn't a huge issue for us at that time, but we responded collectively to that challenge, this big global challenge that had just hit the United States. You know, and some years later, climate change is the big security issue for us, and we can see the level of response from the United States is somewhat wanting. In any case, I wanted to just highlight on this scale of agreements around security when the issue of climate security came through in the Leaders' Declaration. And that was really first in 2009 in Cairns at the Forum Leaders meeting in Cairns. It's where our Pacific leaders recognized it as the greatest challenge of our time. And then every single agreement, every leader's declaration after that pretty much has determined it to be the greatest security threat to Pacific Island countries. Right up to now when the Boe Declaration elevates it up to the level of what we traditionally deal with in hard security issues in the region. So the Boe Declaration is an extremely progressive agreement in my view. It has helped to bring up to the same level climate security, human security, and others into what is normally the big hardcore security challenges that the region discusses. And I think this is really critical. I think we're still very siloed in our approach to this. Climate change people talk to climate change, security hardcore still speaking in those same areas. But this framework will allow us to have those conversations that converge at a point where we have to understand more how the issues of hardcore security, the drug trafficking, might be exacerbated by the impacts of climate change and the decreasing income of our people, our livelihoods, etc. And so I think that this is a very important space to watch and to be a part of an input. And all views need to be a part of this process, not just governments. Climate change security is one focal area in those 5, and these are some of the issues within that the Forum Secretariat and the Forum membership have started to discuss, and the subcommittee on security that's discussing this and will be overseeing its progress are talking about that this week. So there's a range of issues in here that deal with sovereignty and territorial integrity, scenario-based simulations for responses to disasters, NDCs, and a number of other critical issues. So this is a little bit, a very broad summary of some of the work that I've done in the last sort of year with the support of a number of different partners, and this is really just voluntary work. So I have no political bias in representing any countries or just myself and a lot of the people that I was able to talk to. So there are 5 big areas that I feel, when we look at the region with a 50,000-foot view, so we get the big picture, what are some of these big climate fragility issues? Where do they manifest that we need to start really concentrating on better understanding, delving into, so that our responses are much more targeted and effective? So these are the 5 that I came up with. The maritime zone and boundaries issue, the changes in the way that that's happening and the uncertainty around international law that governs that. The displacement and forced migration that is going to happen in the region and indeed is already happening. The decline in the blue economy, which a lot of our economies are based on, tourism, fisheries. The health and productivity of Pacific people, and this is a really scary one. And the coping capacity that we will have with successive and growing natural disasters, cyclones, droughts, etc. So a little bit, and this happens against the backdrop of existing challenges. So this exacerbates existing challenges, so it's not addressed in isolation. So on the maritime zone boundaries issue, this is one that is very real. There is the UN Law of the Sea Convention did not envisage climate change at the time that it was developed. So the EEZs that we have accorded under that international agreement have certain requirements that land has to remain above sea level and has to have some economic benefit to retain that jurisdiction and the right to the resources that exist in that jurisdiction. And so some of our countries, as you know, from these implications are going to lose land and are already suffering that problem. Does that mean that the boundaries are starting to contract? Will they lose part of their jurisdictions and the resources within that? And for some countries, their very existence, especially the low-lying atoll nations. And so we really do need progressive international law and thinking in this space to protect that. And there is a lot of effort in the region that is going into this at the moment. And indeed, I think Pacific countries themselves are leading some of those. The displacement and forced migration issue is a critical one. International agreements and laws that govern the displacement of people due to war, etc., exist. So there are some support to those kinds of refugees and migrants that are forced out from persecution or religious differences or ethnic differences in their own countries. There is no such protection for migrants because of climate change. And I know this in the experience that I have in my own country. We have a Tuvalu community that was invited into Tuvalu at a forum leaders meeting when, basically we've opened up immigration that allows Tuvalu people under the threat of climate change, but we don't have any other progressive laws that support them once they're inside the country, and this is a challenge. The only other one that I want to highlight in this space is really the health and productivity of Pacific people. We face a scenario where 1.5 degrees, that's in 10 years, we will lose between 70 and 90% of our coral reef systems. And at 2 degrees, nearly 100%. Those underpin 25% of all life in the ocean. And for many of our Pacific people, between 70 and 90%, they rely on that source for their food, for their healthy food. And we have a backdrop of NCD crisis already. And so if you take away the free, healthy food that those families have, what do you replace it with? So that is a humanitarian challenge. We have already 1 in 3 children suffering child stunting, and in some countries, 1 in 2. So this is really a massive challenge. I won't go into the other issues because I've run out of time, but I do want to cover just briefly a couple of the entry points because I don't want to leave you with bad news. because I actually am a believer that we can change this. The universal implementation of the Paris Agreement is absolutely critical. Our scientists have already said that. But we need way more than that. Currently, we're on 3.7 with the best case scenario of commitments under the Paris Agreement. We need to change this narrative of one from stopping fossil fuel exploration is going to lose jobs for the economy, and what are you going to do with all the unemployed miners, etc. We need to change that narrative. This is an opportunity. This is the biggest growing business sector in the world. Create the certainty around the renewable energy, around battery storage, empower your young engineers to figure out battery storage. If they do that, they will be the next Bill Gates. So you have a massive business opportunity that is waiting to be harnessed by governments who are progressive and willing to support this kind of regulatory reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not a good moderator, keeping people on time. So I will rely on my colleagues, the rest of my colleagues, to please stick to the time. We've got 15 minutes. So please, Mary.
Cool. Well, kia ora, talofa lava. And a special greeting to our elders in the room. Noa whionga, whiome, Naomi Mataafa, Alpito, William Seal, and no manuvao, Auntie Winnie. Yeah, I'm going to use my 8 minutes because I think it's important to have a youth voice in this space around climate change. So sorry, we're going to go over time. But I also want to acknowledge the dynamic young people in the room, my brothers and sisters. Talofa lava. As mentioned, my name is Mary Moi Onoko Leo, or Mary Ngafamali Toa Sabati Moi Onoko Leo, and I'm from the villages of Whaliwha, Leawa'a, Malie, and Tiawea. And I'm a proud daughter of Samoa and a product of the Pacific. So today I'm here to represent the Pacific Climate Warriors and the work that we do. The Climate Warriors is the Pacific arm of the global movement 350.org, and we are a youth-led grassroots network of climate activists, artists, educators, and leaders from 15 of our Pacific islands, including 5 teams across 3 diaspora, Australia, New Zealand, and Portland, US. Our network endeavours to highlight the vulnerabilities of our island countries to the climate crisis, as well as the strength and the resilience of our communities and our ability to adapt and respond both locally and internationally. The late scholar, climate warrior, Dr. Teresia Te Aiwa, once characterized our connection to our ocean and cultures by saying, "We sweat and cry salt water, so we know that the ocean really is in our blood." As I reflected last night and I thought about the spiritual connection that we have in the Pacific with our islands and our ocean, I thought about the many faces of this climate crisis and the many sides of this issue and the different approaches and narratives that color it. Many of you here today from the Pacific will know this, but for those who don't, the climate crisis for us is no longer a distant threat. While others can come here and talk about their plans for 2030 and 2050, we are feeling the impacts right now. Climate change is now our daily reality, our lived reality. It is more than just an environmental issue, but a manifestation of a much larger ecological crisis, not of our own making, but one that we evidently are the first ones to suffer from. We all know this, but how much of a human connection do many of us in this room actually have to this crisis? Until you know that fear of the prospect of losing your homeland forever, you can never understand the dread that now permeates and fuels the urgency of the Pacific's call to action until you are in our shoes. Climate change is more than conferences, cold data, political posturing, and more conferences. It's a human issue first and foremost. As a threat multiplier, climate change is not a singular issue to be fixed by one or a narrow approach, but one which elevates all the current challenges that we face to a level more difficult to address. It is, as our leaders have declared, the single greatest threat to the Pacific. Today I want to share with you the stories of the front lines of climate change, the realities our people live with, the destruction that climate change continues to wage on our islands. I also want to highlight the importance of the role that young people have in continuing to energize the march towards actual climate justice. So for those who may find it hard to find a connection to what climate change feels like and looks like for our people, let me paint you a picture. It is a sound of distraught mothers and fathers whose families are being torn apart by the financial strain of constantly having to rebuild year after year, flood after flood, and cyclone after cyclone. It's the heartbreak of the young people here in New Zealand schools, many of them in your classrooms for those educators here, who must live with the very real reality that they may not have an island home to return to, or may never have the experience of returning home. It is the sound of desperate prayers in our islands, like when a king tide hits Kiribati with tides that are so big that people have nowhere to run for shelter, and when mothers are left with no other option but to hold hands, tie ropes around their waists, place their babies in buckets, lash to their bodies, and then pray and hope for the best until the tides recede. That is what climate change looks like for our people. Yet despite the grim realities that our people face, our people remain resilient. And our movement is strong because giving up or getting climate activist fatigue is not a luxury that we have. Our strength as Pacific activists is that we are informed by the traditional knowledge of our elders as well as the science of today. We're empowered by the cultural richness of our islands, our histories, our lands, our traditions, which compel us to engage with those who threaten them. As Pacific people, we come from ancestors who have only ever known to love, nurture, and care for the land and the sea. We are taught to never take more than we need and always, always give back where and when we can. Our histories, cultures are spiritually interwoven with and spiritually are interwoven with creation, which is why climate change is a threat to not only our lands, but our very identity as Pacific people. Despite being the world's smallest contributors to carbon emissions, if we don't act now, it's our homes who will be the very first to be lost to the very sea that our ancestors have only ever cared for and respected. I hope that the irony of that is not lost on you and that the magnitude of that injustice is clear. This is why young people like the Pacific Climate Warriors are compelled to action. This crisis, which now looms before us, means that we do not have any other option but to act. We know that the science has been clear for decades that climate change is real and it's imminent. The warnings were loud 30 years ago, but too many of the world's so-called leaders have continued to ignore these warnings. The Pacific now is the canary in the coal mine, warning the world once again that it is our homes and the very existence that is under immediate threat. This is why the role of young people fulfilling their civic duties is critical in holding our leaders to account. This is why young people in the Pacific and across the world have risen to lead the calls for greater action. We see this in the wave of climate strikes inspired by Greta Thunberg. I do want to place a marker here and acknowledge that Pacific young people have been doing this work much longer, much earlier than Greta. And I actually want to acknowledge Brianna and Ray. Brianna has been doing this work for more than half of her life. Ray is a champion for Kiribati. And these two, and many other of the young climate activists in this room, are quite literally the giants who we've had to stand, whose shoulders we've stood on. So we've also seen this activism or this leadership through Pacific Climate Warriors in the Marshall Islands, who in 2015 kick-started the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign, a campaign supported by our elders and which eventually came to be a part of the Paris Agreement. We know that climate change is a defining issue of our time, and that means governments must now commit to a rapid and just transition away from fossil fuels. The Pacific emits less than 0.04 of the world's global emissions. We were the first to ratify Paris, the first to go 100% renewable, tokelau, the first to ban plastics, and the first to update new and more ambitious NDCs, the first to declare climate emergencies at both a national and regional level. Pacific governments continue to stand toe-to-toe with extractive industries and major polluting countries. In this company, New Zealand now needs to step up to the plate and demonstrate the same level of fortitude as the rest of the region. To New Zealand's credit, it has started this after 9 years of being in the wilderness, and we commend the Ardern government for introducing an ambitious piece of climate legislation in the Zero Carbon Bill. This is thanks to the thought leadership of young people, Generation Zero, and the young Pacific climate advocates who wrote, lobbied, and pushed for this vital piece of legislation. Next week is a critical moment for New Zealand as we wait to see if our leaders here in Aotearoa step up and pass an undiluted zero carbon bill. Moreover, if this is the nuclear-free moment of our generation, then New Zealand must have the courage to speak up now as we did then. If New Zealand is to continue calling itself a climate leader in a Pacific country, it needs to lead from its own streets first. Our next door neighbour, Australia, is gearing up, already beginning, almost done, to open up the Adani mine, which will exponentially increase Australia's contribution to the global emissions. This is where New Zealand should show its climate leadership. This is also where we come in. This is why the voice of young Pacific people, or young people in this space, is absolutely critical. Pacific climate warriors fighting alongside our leaders and our frontline communities. New Zealand's leaders cannot pick and choose when and where they take the moral high ground. The recent strikes and the work of young people around the Pacific and around the world is an example of all of you here today who are part of that effort. It's important to remember, especially now in the midst of another moment in our call for climate justice. For many Samoans, we also see this in the Mau movement of Samoa. Traditional elders, the youth, our faith leaders all came together to mobilize for a great cause. I think about the stories that my father shared with my brother and I about how his grandfather and father quit their police job to march for the Mau. Now, 2 weeks ago, my dad marched alongside us as his daughter and young Pacific people sang the same songs that the Mau sang to the steps of the same government. The image that stuck with me was seeing our young people together with our elders, singing that song. That's when we are at our strongest and how we must continue to show up in this fight. If you look at the spirit of our people in the fight, in the face of this climate crisis, and you are not filled with optimism and a resolve to be courageous, you have failed to understand the courage of communities at the front lines of this crisis. Our courage as people is a type of courage that thrives in a perpetual state of rehabilitation. We are more than just broken down seawalls, cyclones, dead breadfruit trees, and fewer fish. We have always been more. We are the story of courage and solidarity and resilience in the face of everything that is thrown our way, and it's this courage that must now be our response to the climate crisis. There is a Samoan proverb that says, "E lele le taloa e ma'au lava I le vai," which means wherever the taloa bird flies, it will always return to the water or its home. Wherever we go as Pacific people, we are rooted in and must always return to our homes. At the end of the day, climate change is more than politics. It is about the taloa who, like us, we too would like to return to our island homes, to the homes of our ancestors, and know that it will be there for our grandchildren. So let me gift you with something to keep you in this fight. In the words that best sums up the spirit of vulnerable communities who, despite everything that is thrown our way, remain resilient, of our team of Pacific climate warriors telling the stories of our people and of young people around the world who, together with our elders, are marching, singing, writing, and speaking for the world that our children deserve. We are not drowning, we are fighting. Malo.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Shelley from Fiji.
Naka Pene. So, first of all, thank you again to the organizers for having me here for this meeting. I also want to acknowledge the leaders that are in the room, the wisdom, the expertise that sit in this room, but more importantly, the love for this region, the love for the Pacific, the love for our oceans. One of the key questions, our take-off questions that was given to us as a guide was to look at how are Pacific leaders tackling the issue of climate change and what are the new approaches? And the second question that was there is, what are the new approaches that are being brought to the table? As we heard already, Pacific leaders have taken a leadership role at global level. If you look at the communique that came out from Tuvalu, all of us must read that. It's a call to action. That's a call to action in December. And the call to action is to the international community. Let's be really clear, all of us sitting in here, we are international. Right? And so, the focus for us, which we've been talking about, is the urgency to limit global emissions to 1.5. And what we see is business as usual. So I'm going to reflect on an international located in the Pacific. And this is now my call to, and I'm excited for the future for young people. You have a lot. Do not feel you're alone. There's a whole community out there. What we need to do is to take leadership. And I want to thank the Deputy Prime Minister of Samoa for raising that the thing that we have to address as Pacific Islanders is governance and leadership. I'll come back to those points. So we cannot have business as usual. If you look at what the international, and I speak here this afternoon as a head of an international organization. We've been around for 77 years. 77 years. The ethos, what's in our DNA, is to speak out about injustice. We were given the most privileged position 3 years ago. The whole of Oxfam, it's an international NGO. We're a $1 billion organization. There's 10,000 staff. We work in 90 countries. It's not sustainable. It just isn't. So decision-making was devolved down to the countries that we work in, and it was devolved down to the regions. Oxfam New Zealand worked with Oxfam Australia to put on the table that the Pacific was going to be a region on its own inside Oxfam. And it came from an understanding of, and this is what I want to say is here, if there is a friend of the Pacific who knows us really well at the international space, it's New Zealand. You understand self-determination at its heart. Decision-making is about self-determination. We are the privileged ones. We are the ones who can talk to governments. But we sit in a region, when you look at the UN Decolonization Committee, 16 countries are there waiting. 6 of those come from our region. So if you want to talk about leave no one behind, in humanitarian, not good enough. You've got to talk about the political as well. So that's what Oxfam New Zealand did. They fought at that global level, at Oxfam level, to say that the Pacific wasn't going to be coupled with Asia. So the hard work was done. Then there is the team in the Pacific. We are like I said, this has been an exercise, and this is what, in international level, if you want urgency to address climate change, It is about those of us with privilege and power. We've got to check that. It is about behaviors, because that's what we've had for so long. Lots of power, lots of privilege, and you think it's about the money? And we've had to reframe that. And that's what I want to say here, is that that's what we've done in the last 3 years. We've played with the minds inside Oxfam. NGOs speak, we must have results at scale. And we challenged that. Because in the INGO world, or in the NGO world, or in the private sector world, this notion of scalability, you want it to scale, throw more money at it. Throw more money. So what we did in Oxfam was to say, you know, they can throw all the money they want at us in the Pacific, but it's not going to address what we've got, because we're not at the decision-making table. That's one. We're not articulating who we are. But then let's do it ourselves. Let's cross-check our privileges. Let's cross-check our behaviors. Who are we accountable for? Who are we speaking to? We've worked in the Pacific for 20 years, and yet we work in PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Fiji. That's not the Pacific. And so the call had to go back to us, those of us who are in the organization, to say, if we're going to build an organization based on Pacific values, this is about, if we are an international organization working here in this region, then what is our unique value proposition? What is our relevance? If Oxfam wanted to devolve power down to the country level, that's about decision-making, yep. That's about leadership, and also it's about impact. So we had to say, because you get a certain pot of money to do this work, for us, regionalism is regionalism is what we grew up with. Regionalism outside, the only other place where regionalism is strong is in the EU. In the Pacific, we have years, decades and decades. And it's probably a good thing that it's not structured like the EU, because what holds us together is our relationships and the connections that we've had. So we had to say back to Oxfam, you know what? With that same pot of money, we can give you results at scale. We'll work in the 14 countries. We can even move it up to 20. They didn't believe us. And we showed how that was going to be done, because it was never about us. And that's another Pacific value. You share what you have in your hands. It's never about you. It's about all of us. We know this story really well. When we have to invite people to a gathering, how about them? They have to come too. And so there's this notion, when you see somebody, just come, And it just happens, everything. And so what we've had to do is to say that we work alongside our partners, our other civil society organizations, but the money cannot sit inside Oxfam. It needs to go to our partners. We're undergoing, so in terms of 1.5 and urgency, we've had to rethink our footprint. 144 staff working in just 5 countries, not good enough. Those resources sit with our partners. So we've had to take a 1.5 urgency, redeploy those resources. Redeploy those resources, because it's about having that impact at scale. So climate change, addressing climate change is not just something that we take care of in the environment space. It is about a bread and butter issue, but a lot of it is about cross-checking our values. I know I'm standing in the way of Hofti. So I want to say to the youths is that, oops. So sorry, Kate, if I can just make 2 more points. One is around our most difficult conversation. Initially, we thought, the difficult one was with Oxfam, with Australia. But actually, the difficult conversation was amongst ourselves. because we had to give up. Because for so long, we had received these resources, and we had to say that we needed to ensure that we worked in the Northern Pacific, that if we talk about climate change, then it's about ensuring that we address issues of atoll nations. So as an example of what it looks like on the ground when it hits the ground, in February this year, the Marshall Islands put forward a very radical idea. And so the radical idea is that they're going to raise the atoll. We're not moving, and that's really clear. We are not victims. We are here to stay. Raise the atoll, a meeting, and you can read it's on the Radio New Zealand website. It's a plug for you. And in July, before the climate, on the margins of the Climate Action Pacific Partnership meeting, we had a meeting together with the donor community. We had the privilege of being in that room, Oxfam. So first they did the science, and it's like, yep, we know the science. Now what's going to happen? What are we going to do about it? And then it turns up, oh no, we can't raise the atoll because that's development. That's not climate change. So that needs to be reframed. So our response to that, this is what international organizations have, is that we have leverage. We're part of an international family. It's the job now of organizations like Oxfam in the NGO community to hold our other global partners accountable and tell them, work on your governments. Those policies, at the very least, really, the underlying component is that it is about neocolonialism. I mean, that's really it, yeah. So those are the kinds of things that, and so raising the atoll, that is a bold, that is a radical idea that's on the table that I want to put forward to the youth. Please, let's, as what Karen was saying, be angry, be impatient for social change. And the last message that I have is that not imagine, this is going to happen. Imagine it's 2027, and the Nobel Economics Prize will be awarded to the Pacifica Youth Coalition for their radical idea on looking on the economics, on looking on social justice, because it's about addressing poverty. This year's Nobel Economics Prize went to these 3 people who's put forward an economics model. Then they tested about eradicating poverty. Let's take that on. Let's ensure that it's just transition is about just economies that takes care of its people. Naka.
Thank you, Vinaka. Thank you, Rajeli. Now, we've discussed a little bit about adaptation, and we're going to adapt a little bit here. As you'll note, afternoon tea is being served because we've kind of gone into afternoon tea time, but I didn't want to miss out the questions, so I will ask some more questions while you're getting afternoon tea served. You can, of course, go to the bathroom or stretch your legs as well, but I will, if the panel is okay with that, just ask a few of these questions because we've got a flood coming in on Slido. I guess the first one is, which pathway is more realistic for Pacific Island countries in dealing with the issue of climate change, adaptation or mitigation, or a mixture of both?
It's a mixture of both. Absolutely has to be done. You absolutely have to do both. Without mitigation or emission reduction, then you're not going to get funding for adaptation or reducing the risk. For me, it's about risk management. So you weigh out the economic risk, the physical impacts, before you can actually then respond to a lot of these issues. The other difference, though, is when you're talking mitigation, it's global. But when you're talking adaptation, it's local. So it's very two different response. But you have to bear in mind, the ultimate objective of the convention is to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. So it's about mitigation, stabilization, and it never spells out what that level may be.
Yep, there's one from Coral.
Add very briefly to that. 2 points. One is that there is opportunity in mitigation that equates to adaptation. Right, for the Pacific, moving away from fossil fuel dependency, which we know global spikes in oil prices have sent our economies into disarray. In the past, we need to be independent of that kind of imported source of energy. We've got the most sunshine in the world, let's use it. There's, Germany became the leader in solar power. They get 2 hours of sunlight. How did that happen? So we need to really look for that opportunity, and governments are responsible for creating the enabling environment to encourage the private sector to come in and the startup companies to be innovative and invest in that area. The other critical issue I'd like to suggest is it's not just adaptation and mitigation. There are many things we cannot adapt to. We can build our resilience long enough to hopefully withstand that level of change and be able to deal with some of it, but we are going to lose. There is a huge loss and damage issue that we will have to address. And it's not just economics, it is the loss of culture and heritage and thousands of years of evolution of our navigational experience. And that is not just a loss to our countries, it's a loss to the global community. It's our humanitarian diversity as a globe. Thank you.
Great. Another question here. Do you think much is being talked about in terms of the New Zealand and the Pacific step up? Should New Zealand call out Australia on their stance on climate change?
Can I respond to that? So this is where we have to really go back to our values. Is it something that we would do is shame somebody publicly? Right? That's what I want to start from. So rather than calling it that, there are other mechanisms that are in place. Yeah? And we've got to use that. So I just want to say that the kind of world that we are imagining has to be a world that's inclusive, has to be a world that practices our values. Now, if we're going to do that publicly, think about her grandchildren. What is the kind of values that you are putting out there? Right? We don't want to be remembered for shaming, for making that happen. In the Pacific, at the Pacific Islands Forum, when Fiji had to leave the forum, it was a difficult decision for our Pacific leaders, because we don't do that, yeah? But we understand the kind of, the environment in the way that happened. There are many others, I know that it's complex, but I want to say that we address other avenues. Yeah?
Yeah.
You have to be careful what you wish for. One of the fundamental principles of the UNFCCC is the principle of sovereignty of states in international cooperation to address climate change and the right to develop, so that there's no international sort of legally binding agreement to allow people to meet their target. It's all voluntary commitments. If you put, in terms of New Zealand, there's a lot of really wonderful words I hear this morning and this about New Zealand's position. We still haven't sorted out our position. New Zealand is very unique. We're very unique because our emissions is the methane, almost 48% is our major emission target, gas, not the carbon dioxide, for example. But the problem with the methane is it's a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's got a high global warming potential. So that needs to be addressed in the short term. The New Zealand current position, without no regrets policies and economic instruments like the emissions trading scheme, or even better, put a carbon tax on, then you're not going to, you're basically buying our way out of the agriculture sector. So you have to be really, Australia they're smart enough to figure out the Kiwis are trying to cook the books, really. And that's why it's very hard. The other thing about our position, we're talking about 2050 target. What we are really, globally, we still have a lot of residual heat, that we have to deal with. And we're talking about the front. So you not only just have to deal with what your plans for the future, but you have to use negative technologies to take up what is already committed in the atmosphere because of the long life of some of these powerful gases. So you have to be really, really careful. And finally, in terms of Australia, I'm not defending Australia per se, but you know, Australia has big markets. Who's those markets for coal? China, India, Indonesia. So even if we're all going to go this way and you allow these 3 countries in our region to go ahead, that's a big problem for us and the climate as a whole. And that's why we're looking at other technologies like what we're doing in geoengineering. And by the way, primarily we have to do emission reductions. There's no doubt about that. But we need to have some sort of like insurance scheme. Like when you're in a cancer patient, you already got the cancer, you haven't figured out, you know, the source, how to cure the source of the problem. But you still need to do chemotherapy to try and slow down the problem. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what I'm an optimistic. You know, it's not doom and gloom. The world will continue. I'm optimistic that with our capability and our, you know, knowledge as humans, we can be able to solve the problem.
Great, thank you. Now, I apologise, but that pretty much is where we have to draw the line. We have another exciting session coming up, including an address from our very own Minister for Pacific Peoples. But I do thank you all for your passionate and informative addresses, and of course, Mr. James Renwick in Wellington as well, and Pene for your chairmanship.
I just want to state, you know, I asked the question, fossil fuel subsidies at the beginning. In 2015, it was US $425 billion. So your $1 billion for X1, nothing compared to the subsidies on fossil fuels. So that's a big challenge that we need to work on.